Good morning, I'm Tom Christensen again, and this is the fourth in our series on World War I and World War II. Today we're going to talk about trench life, and I think you'll find it very interesting, and I think you'll gain an appreciation for the men that fought this war, because it was a war fought under extraordinarily horrible conditions, and yet they persevered. So let's talk a little bit about the trenches. You'll remember last time I said the trenches extended all the way from the North Sea, all the way down through Belgium and France, all the way to Switzerland. Hundreds of miles of trenches. The trenches were separated by an area not owned by anyone, and therefore it was called no man's land. And in no man's land, it meant it was the exact area between the frontline trench of the Allies and the frontline trench of the Germans. Early in the war, no man's land was a very, very short distance. In fact, it was anywhere from 30 to 50 yards in between. And because of that, you see different items, and I mentioned this last time, I found my first primitive grenade of types that was thrown back and forth at the Germans from the Allied side, and as I said before, it would oftentimes be returned. Let me just show you how it worked. You can see it here on the top. There's a safety ring here. You would pull that ring, hold onto it, and then throw it like a frisbee. And you would hope that it would land in such a way that would hit a stone or something sharp, and one of these cartridges that was inserted here would go off and therefore explode the rest of the metal object into tiny pieces that would wound people. So again, this was a very primitive type of first grenade that was used in the trenches, but generally speaking, only in the first 6 months of World War I, and because no man's land continued to get farther and farther apart. Initially, the sides actually came up with agreements not to shoot at each other, and because of that reason, some of the officers decided to send trench mortars into the opposing side, and so the lines became farther and farther apart, so far apart that in some cases no man's land was anywhere from a half a mile to a mile wide. And what does that mean? That means at night troops from both sides would oftentimes get up and patrol no man's land, making sure that the enemy was not coming any closer to your line, making sure that he wasn't digging a trench from his line to become closer to your line so that he could protect himself during an impending attack. And so they would patrol these. Some of these patrols obviously ran into each other, and the results were very bloody. The other thing that's most noticeable is that in no man's land, an article called barbed wire. Most of us are familiar with barbed wire fencing that would be around keeping our cattle and cows and things like that in. Barbed wire was extensively used during World War I. Millions and millions of miles of barbed wire was laid by both sides in World War I. And they would lay this at least 100 yards forward of their frontline trenches, and oftentimes in rows of at least three rows of extensive barbed wire. And they did this to ensure that during an attack, the enemy would have to stop and cut the wire to be able to come across, and they could only come across in certain areas then. And of course, it was much easier to defend because they would place a machine gun and fire directly at that area, a crossing area. That's another reason there were gaps in the wire on purpose, and that's where the patrols would go out at night. But of course, neither the Germans nor the Allies knew where those gaps in the wire were. It looked like one continuous strand. And generally there were 3 different rows of strands. So they had to cut through 3 different rows to be able to attack the trench. And so again, you can see how difficult an attack would be and how costly an attack would be. The other thing is these barbed wire insulations or guardians of the trenches were installed at night. So troops would go out of the trenches at night, unroll these things, and of course they had to be fastened to something, and so they would have iron poles. Initially, they would pound them down. But then they found out that when the enemy heard that pounding going on, they would sweep with machine gun fire. So they came up with a system where they would corkscrew the metal poles down into the ground. And if you travel in France and Belgium even today, you'll see those metal poles along the roadsides, or in some cases in the ditches or in the fields, still remnants of the battle that occurred there between 1914 and 1918. Let's describe the trenches a little bit. Let's take a look here, and I think one of the things that you see in this trench that was all too prevalent was water. And it's going to result in a thing called trench foot that I'll describe later on, but that meant that the soldiers, if it had rained, were in constant water. You can see they have their protective masks there. If they stood in those for a day or two, they would get a disease, so to speak, called trench foot, which I'll describe later. The trenches became very intricate, though. You can see here's a later trench, probably from 1917, 1918, and you can see the trench itself is reinforced by corrugated steel. They have sandbags on top, which they put up at night. They fill the bags with sand and put them up at night. The soldiers could walk back and forth in the trench without being observed by the enemy, and they had steps on the trench, so in case of attack, they would rise up on the steps so that they would be able to fire. Now, one of the things that was very, very prominent during that time was sniping, and I'll talk more about that in a future lecture, but sniping occurred from both sides, where the enemy would know where these steps were, zero in on that area, actually place their rifle in a almost like a bowl, and just wait, and if they saw a helmet come up, or they would just squeeze off the trigger, and of course there were casualties due to sniping every day. The way they got around that, and the way they could observe outside the trench, was to develop a periscope. And let me just see here for a second. You can see this officer here is holding up a periscope. He's looking through this periscope. He's in the safety of the trench behind the sandbags, but his periscope could look out on no man's land and detect any type of movement that would occur. There was, in fact, though, constant attrition during a regular day, a day that saw no attack by snipers and by artillery. Let's talk a little bit about soldier life. Now, one of the things that is natural to any human being is the fact that he has to relieve himself. And so they had a method by which they had to go back from the frontline trenches at least 100 or 200 yards back behind the front lines to relieve themselves. And they had special areas where people could sit on logs and things like that. It was dug out. It was then filled with lime and things, but you can imagine the stench and the fact that there was definitely hundreds or even thousands of flies in these areas. Some soldiers suffered pretty heavy casualties during this period due to this, because they were exposed, and so when artillery would come in, oftentimes it would be long of the front line and would kill the soldiers 100 to 200 yards back. But just a basic human need of that became really a dangerous thing to think about. The other thing that they had to do, or tried to do, was to relieve the amount of flies that gathered on the battlefield. And the reason there were millions and millions, probably trillions of flies, was the amount of people that were left out in no man's land after an attack. And of course, they couldn't go out and get the bodies, and so the flies were buzzing constantly. And in fact, one of the soldiers said that the hum of flies was a natural thing. It was just constant. It was literally a hum that occurred over the battlefield for the entire war. The only time when the flies didn't hum for a short time was after a gas attack, which the poison gas then would not only cause casualties to human beings, but kill also the flies. We'll talk a little bit about the other major problems in the trenches having to do with rats and fleas in a little bit later. The other most dangerous thing, and here again I'll just refer you to this thing. We talked, this photo here, we talked a little bit about trench foot. Trench foot was basically when a human being is in water for a day, 2 days, or 3 days, his feet would literally become infected, gangrene would occur, and just as an example, of the 60,000 Canadian troops that were killed in World War I, trench foot occurred in about 5,000 of those cases. And in many cases, trench foot required amputations of the toes or of the entire foot. So it was a real issue there. And they did try to combat trench foot by removing the water in the trench here, you'll see down here again, with pumps. And they had hand pumps, and they also had diesel fuel operated pumps, and to try to get the water out. But one of the things about World War I, which is kind of, they're still trying to figure it out, is it set records from 1914 to 1918. Record-setting rains occurred in Europe, and some historians have thought that because it's oftentimes cloudy in Northern Europe, in Belgium or in France, in these areas, and it doesn't rain. Well, because of all the artillery that was going off, it was almost like seeding the clouds, and it would rain because of the amount of artillery. At any rate, the amount of rain has never been equaled in modern history for the amount of rain that occurred in Belgium and France from 1914 to 1918. And of course, you can see from the trenches, there was a danger of getting trench foot. It later became the rule, each soldier generally carried 3 pairs of socks. And it became the rule that the non-commissioned officer, a sergeant, or even the junior officer, a lieutenant, and sometimes even a captain, would actually check his men to ensure that they changed their socks and that they were drying other socks during this time period. All the men wore woolen uniforms, and that wool, of course, absorbed the rain, and it also became exceedingly hot during the summer months. Food and water was also an object that was very, very important in trench life. Water was unique in that here's a canteen, for example. This is a World War I German canteen. And of course, each soldier had a canteen with about 1 quart of water in it. This water was distributed from the rear. They brought them up to the communication trenches, to the front lines, and the canteens were filled. Unfortunately, the water cans that they used were generally old fuel cans. And so almost all the soldiers complained that the water tasted like gasoline or diesel fuel or something like that. They weren't washed well, or the washing that occurred probably didn't take that taste away. And there's a lot of complaints by soldiers in World War I as for the quality of water. Food was another item that came up. Food came up to the front periodically, almost daily in some cases, if there wasn't an attack going on. It started out hot, probably a mile behind the front line, and they came up through the communication trenches in mermite cans and distributed the food. By the time it got to the frontline soldier, depending on how you were in the line of being fed, would depend on how hot or cold your food was. Generally, it was cold, but it was still welcome because of the fact that the food was something that at least had been prepared. Now, I must say that even though it had been brought up from the rear, in certain cases it couldn't be brought up, and then soldiers would rely on what was called hardtack. And hardtack was just that. It was very hard. It was like a biscuit, like a cracker, only it was so hard that you couldn't bite into it and break it off generally. You usually had to boil it by yourself. It was the only way to eat it. The stew that they did bring up from the rear was generally a mixture, and one soldier said, God knows what's in it. Okay, it was a little bit of meat, and generally speaking, it was probably old horse flesh, were horses that had been killed in the artillery. They were immediately used, and some of that flesh was boiled, and there were some potatoes. It would not be something that we would probably care for today. In some cases, it was also filled with maggots. Okay, so it was very, very, very not appealing. The other thing that was the biggest problem in the front was there were no fresh vegetables at all. Okay, so when vegetables did occur, it was very, very uncommon, and it was a real treat. And because of that, scurvy, the lack of vitamin C, no fruit and vegetables was common. Soldiers generally would become very pimple-faced because they did not have the correct nutrients in their food. So the only way that soldiers were rescued from this life of horrible food was that they would get packages, oftentimes sent all the way from the States or Canada or Great Britain, and eat those packages with food in them that their loved ones as far away as Canada or the US would send forward. And so gift packs were oftentimes shared. It was common, it was expected almost that if you were in a squad, then you got a package of food, that you would share that food with your trench mates. Mail was the other thing. Mail was actually a pretty common occurrence in World War I. It was brought up to the front just about every 2 or 3 days, if during a regular period in the trench when there was an attack going on. It did take a while. Mail was censored going back, obviously. Generally, most of the soldiers didn't write about the life in the trenches because they didn't want to scare their family, and likewise the family wrote mainly about their relatives. Everyone in the trench, I'd say 99% of the soldiers, smoked during that time. Tobacco was a common thing, and it wasn't just because they enjoyed smoking. They smoked a pipe or smoked cigarettes. Those tobacco products were generally furnished by the authorities. The Germans were always very, very thankful if they found or killed Canadians or Americans because they had better tobacco, and they would oftentimes rifle the body to get the tobacco out. The pipes and cigarettes that were smoked were also a way to keep the flies away from you, and they were also a way that you would alleviate the stench of the trench, and the stench of the trench based upon the bodies and things like that. As I said before, rats were a common occurrence in the trench. One soldier remarked that the rats seemed as big or bigger than cats. They were obviously feeding on the bodies in no man's land that people could not recover. And some of those bodies were out there for a year or 2 years, right up to the end of the war, so that when you go in a cemetery today in World War I areas, at least 50%, sometimes more, of the gravestones there say "a soldier known but to God," which was a phrase from Rudyard Kipling. You might remember him from the Jungle Book. He wrote that. They were not able to identify the soldier anymore. Sometimes they would identify the patch, and so they would say a Canadian soldier or a British soldier. Sometimes they couldn't identify anything, and so they were buried as they were found, but oftentimes as much as a year or 2 later. Okay, rum was also a common occurrence in the trench, and rum was brought forward in kegs that were marked SRD, and that meant Supply Reserve Depot. The soldiers looked forward to their rum ration. They always had a rum ration before an attack, and I think we can understand perhaps why. That would make it alleviate some of the displeasure of attacking, I guess. But they would also get a weekly ration of rum. The ration of rum would be given to them in a line based upon from their non-commissioned officer. If a soldier had done something wrong during the week, maybe hadn't worked hard enough, his ration of rum would then be shared by other mates, and he would lose his own ration of rum. The SRD, Supply Reserve Depot, it was noted on the casks that were brought up. The soldiers didn't call it the supply reserve depot. They called it, they said seldom runs dry. That was one of the names. And then another soldier said it meant seldom reaches its destination, meaning that the soldiers that brought the rum up would oftentimes take a part of the rum until by the time it got there, it wasn't very full. And rum was, again, a common occurrence.